panelists, Keith Beauchamp, Michael Reilly, and Fred.
Oh, I'm sorry.
The filmmaker, Frederick Zollo.
So Kelley, you want to just give like a one-sentence introduction just so the audience knows who they are?
Sure. So, again, Frederick Zollo here in the middle, the filmmaker Mississippi. I also many Broadway shows. Keith Beauchamp, the documentary filmmaker of the Untold story of Emmett Till. Michael Reilly is screenwriter, and actually Michael and Fred and Keith are currently working on the forthcoming movie about Emmett Till, which will complete your trilogy, Fred.
So I'm David Certo. I'm Director of Programming Administration here at the Sheen Center. Again, just welcome to the Sheen Center. We're so honored to have you here today. We understand that you need to catch a bus at some point, so we want to make sure that you have an opportunity to talk to the panelists. So what we're going to do is Kelley and I have some questions. We're going to hold those till later, and we're going to give you an opportunity first. So maybe if we could just raise the house lights a bit. And I believe there is a microphone on the aisle. So if any of you have questions, we just ask that you make your way over to the microphone. There we go. Always takes one to get things started. Thank you very much. Could you say your name and what grade you're in, sir?
Oh, okay, thank you. My name is Quincy Campbell. I am a senior in high school. First of all, I would like to thank you for giving us the chance to watch this film. We're very honored. I have a question about behind the scenes of this film. I was wondering what inspired you to use Mississippi in this time period as a setting to tell the story of these two FBI members? I noticed there's an A story and sort of like a B story, and on the A story is sort of like more like a buddy cop kind of film, and it's using, in the setting of it, it's kind of a very harsh and real setting in which real events took place. And again, those people, as you stated earlier, were real people that did die, even though the police officers, you changed their names, a lot of them were related to real people and real events that happened. So what inspired you to use that setting for a fictional buddy cop story?
Fred, I guess this one would be directed to you.
The genesis of the movie came, a very old friend of mine who's a wonderful screenwriter named Chris Girod, and had just graduated from many years in college. Hopefully you guys will finish school quicker than 7 or 8 years, which it took him. But anyway, we were looking to, there was something he had written that we eventually did do, but we were looking to do something, and there was an article in like the New York Post or the Daily News, and it was about a book that really could have came and went, but it was about the secret war in the early to middle 60s between the FBI and the Ku Klux Klan. And what was particularly interesting about, among many things, is that the FBI and the Ku Klux Klan had many similarities. Many members of the FBI were Southern, like the character that Hackman plays, who is kind of an amalgam of two agents who were really on the case. But they were Southerners. They weren't very happy with the civil rights movement. They hated communists. They didn't have any black friends, let's put it that way. Hoover himself despised Martin Luther King. He spent a decade threatening Martin Luther King, even writing death threats to Martin Luther King, telling him he should disappear, or they were going to issue terrible things about him to the public. So their relationship, this racist organization, and the FBI, who were supposed to be on the right side of this, came to this amazing moment at the disappearance and murder of Goodman, Schorner, and Cheney, because they were then confronted with actually doing the right thing. And with all of their unpleasantness toward the civil rights movement, in this case, they did. They used the Civil Rights Act of 64-5 of the Johnson administration to bring to justice these, with the exception of Lawrence Rainey, who was the sheriff, Gaylord Sartain plays in the movie, who was acquitted. He was not there. He was not present in the clearing when the murders were committed, but they actually brought them to justice. And the state of Mississippi did not prosecute them. And so Chris said, what do you think of this? And we said, well, there's a great movie here. In retrospect, we didn't want to make a documentary, like this guy did on Emmett Till, the definitive story of Emmett Till on film at the moment. We wanted to make a movie that maybe would get a broader audience. And so we changed the names to protect most of the guilty. And it became a sort of thriller, which at first people were very happy with because they found it very, they could see it in it. And I think Alan Parker and Peter Bijou, who won the Oscar for this film, who was the cinematographer, brilliantly captured the period and the horrors of the period. But some people felt, well, why can't we have, it all should be true. And people would pick out things that weren't true. My favorite was the great Pauline Kael, who was a very famous film critic, who had a problem with James Chaney being in the back seat when they were stopped by the police. And it was this sort of thing, like, well, we tried to explain he actually was. He was driving when they were arrested at 4 p.m. that day, only because he tried to outrace the police, but they had a flat tire. So they were arrested, and then when they were released around midnight that evening, they put Chaney in the back seat, the cops, the Ku Klux Klan cops, and that's where he was when he was murdered. Or he actually ran when he was shot. So the question of what is factually true and what is actually true, we tried our best to be reasonably factually correct, but we kind of wanted to tell this story in the most powerful way possible. And the great Willie Morris, who would become very important in the next film in Ghost of Mississippi, great Southern writer, he would always quote Faulkner when he was around the set. And Faulkner said, it's not the facts that interest us, it's the truth. And so hopefully, looking at the film now 30 some odd years later, 30 years to 2 months later, it still packs a wallop, I think.
It's interesting. I mean, those types of discussions are even going on today with like Oscar-nominated films like The Green Book, where there's that talk about, what's the artist's responsibility between accuracy as opposed to taking artistic licenses for those deeper truths. So it's a very timely issue that's still being discussed.
It's also the question of if you put this as a true story on the screen.
Yeah.
We did not.
Yeah.
We made it very clear that it was based on events, but in the case of Ghost of Mississippi, we said this is a true story because whatever you may think of that film, we did an enormous amount of scholarship. Marianne Vollers wrote a book called Ghost of Mississippi. She spent 1 hour with Mrs. Evers. We have 66 hours of recorded interviews with Merle Evers. We spent 300 hours with Bobby DeLauder, who was the prosecutor in the case. She never met him. She supposedly wrote the scholarly book on the subject. We did the scholarship. But still, because it's a movie, people say, well, wait a minute, did that happen the way that happened? But in that case, I'll stand by that it's a true story. In this case, it's a movie.
Sure.
Does that help?
Yes, it does. It does answer a few questions I've had. Thank you.
Do we have any other questions?
There is a hand.
There's a hand. Could you work your way? Thank you. And actually, if anybody else has questions, if you just work your way and just line up behind, so just in the interest of time, so we can get as many questions in.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Jordan and I'm a junior. My question is, of all the possible titles you could have picked for this movie, why did you pick Mississippi Burning? Like, what resonates with that with you guys when you decided what title you were going to pick for the movie?
That was a big moment with Chris and I when we were kind of concocting it year after year. Of course, no one wanted to make this movie. It's really the great Arthur Krim, who was a remarkable figure in both the Civil Rights Movement and the Democratic Party, who he and his law partner, Bob Benjamin, in the early 50s, bought what used to be United Artists, which was bankrupt, and they created an amazing studio who made 15 or so Oscar-winning film, Best Pictures. Anyway, they had formed a company called Orion at this point, who made this film. And getting it made was a miracle, and it was really because of Arthur and Eric Pleskow. And we were in the third or fourth year. Chris was writing the script. No one wanted it. We hoped we would get someone to make it. And we had finally, because of the Freedom of Information Act, gotten our hands on some of the case files. Keith is very familiar with this. Keith is very cozy with the FBI. The FBI at that point weren't being very helpful to us. And they were still the bad FBI. They weren't the We Hate Trump FBI or the FBI on television with handsome models playing FBI agent. They were the mean, evil, spying, we hate people FBI. So finally we got our hands on some of the redacted files, and many of them on the top had this sort of code word that said, M-I-B-U, my burn, my burn, my burn, my burn, my burn. And Keith can tell you what my burn is.
Well, my burn stands for Mississippi Burning. And so...
that's what the case was called. So that's where the title, and with a moment, Chris said, my burn, and we found out it was, took Keith 3 minutes to figure this out. It took us 3 years. And we said, Mississippi, are you fucking kidding me? Well, it's a hit movie. Because the title's so great. I mean, not since Gone with the Wind is there a great title. This is a great title. And Mississippi Burning was what the case was called, so that's why it was called Mississippi.
It's better than going with my burn.
I was going with my burn. Today you would go with my burn, you know.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, my name is Aiden Stewart. I'm a sophomore, and my question would be, but I never really was aware of how truly bad and brutal it was in those times, and I like to be informed on this type of stuff, just really so I can learn and whatnot. I just want to know how much of I'm just wondering, was some of the stuff in the movie dramatized or whatever to kind of give it a movie aspect, or would you say in that time there really was this constant and the type of abuse and this high corruption within these type of areas? Because I would like to be informed on that type of stuff. Thank you.
I think Keith, you can speak to that.
Well, it's amazing you're saying this. Things cosmetically may have changed in Mississippi now, but there are things that are still the same. Most of my work is done in the Deep South, and to bear witness to the film today and to my expertise in dealing with these type of cases and my experience working in the South, I have to say some things remain the same. It's not so far-fetched, and it just amazes me that you're a young person and you came up and you made the statement. Are things back then, are they different now, basically? I have to tell you, in many areas of Mississippi, especially in the Delta of Mississippi, things remain the same. And so just for everyone who's here, all the young people, I just want you to inform yourselves a little bit more about this history. Understands that this history is not necessarily history, it's the present. And that we're still out here on the front lines fighting against the social ill.
I say to Keith and Michael, because they've written the script of a feature film about the murder of Emmett Till. Keith made the definitive documentary on the subject and knows more about it, I think, than virtually any living person. But I say to Michael, and you know, whenever we portray the time, well, aren't they a little bit like, you know, there's these cartoon characters, the fat Southern sheriff, who, you know, who is incredibly racist, and I'm always saying, like, can we? And the both of them say, you know, it was worse.
Unfortunately, there's just no shortage of records and CBS newsreel and interviews and letters written that not only talk about but admit to the kind of violence that you saw portrayed here, and it's not worth making opaque at the risk of telling a lie or, you know,
It was worse than is in the film. One little note: the moment when there's a moment when Michael Rooker, who boy is he a good villain in this movie. He's a great guy, by the way. So he plays
Daryl's brother from The Walking Dead.
yes, he's a wonderful actor and a wonderful guy. But when he attacks the news photographer, it was a real incident. The news photographer in the film is played by the great Bob Colesbury, who produced the film with me, who tragically passed away 10 years ago. But anyway, that's Bobby Colesbury getting the camera shoved in his face. So I just was thinking of Bob when I see the movie.
Yeah.
One last story about Bob. When we shot the big Klan meeting, that's Stephen Tobolowsky, of course, from Groundhog Day, if you remember him in Groundhog Day. Ned Ryerson, isn't that who he plays in it? Anyway, he had this, as you can see, there's a zillion extras and a zillion cars, and it's a gigantic scene. And the day before and through the night was monsoon rains. I mean, there were 3 feet of water in Jackson, and we were 40 miles outside of Jackson because we'd gotten this piece of land for free from someone who didn't want to shoot us. And so we had shot the night before, and so I went to bed about 4 a.m. and the windows were like cracking in the Holiday Inn where we were staying in Jackson, and looked outside, and it was the end of the world. It was the Great Flood. It was Noah's Ark was needed. I thought, what are we going to do? We have to start shooting at 6 p.m. We have 5,000, 10,000 extras coming. And so I got in my car, and it took me 2.5 hours to drive 30 miles or so to this location, because it was just the end of the world. Couldn't see. And I get there, and the field is a foot underwater already from the previous night in the morning. And I have my waders on because of the shot, all that stuff in the swamps when they're looking for the bodies. I put them on, and I'm on this downpour, and can't see, and I'm walking out in the middle of the field, and way in the distance there's a human being there. And I'm thinking, who would be crazy enough, other than me, to be out here in this disaster? And as I get closer, it's Bob Colesbury. And he's already there. And I go up to him, and he's smoking a cigarette. How he managed to do that in this downpour, I have great admiration for him for that. And he said, and he looks at me for a long moment, and he takes a big puff of cigarette, and he looks at me, he goes, "We'll be okay." And you saw the scene.
Wow.
And that we were okay. So, that's Bob Colesbury.
I have one quick thing to add. This is just something I cannot leave without asking. I just don't understand how someone can have such hatred of someone else just because of like the color of the skin or the way they look. And I mean like serious hatred. I just really want to know, like, where does it come from? And I feel like you are the best people to ask since you're so well informed and you literally made this movie. So I would love to know this. Thank you.
Sure.
Give you the easy one.
You know, it's not a soundbite that I can offer up. There are amazing minds that have put their entire lives into trying to figure this out. But it's as simple to me as who profits, who gains, and an idea like racism. And we could have a long conversation about why racism is something that human beings had to take time to conceive. But an idea like racism is a money grab. It's so some people gain and some people lose. It's like any other story that's ever been told from one person to another. We know a story's over when there's a winner and a loser, right? So the hate is an insecurity and a fear that has been tapped into by a storyteller who wanted to figure out a way to have more. And we could digress into a conversation between racism and class and start to figure out why it is that other people don't have the self-assuredness or the fundamental safety where they have to feel better than others. But it is a system that was created so that a lie could keep some people in power and keep others oppressed. And it's not always about color, sometimes it's about gender, right? There are a lot of different ways that people keep control over one another. If you think about hate as a way into justifying a system of imbalance, then you start to see why it's persevered for so long. Now, what makes one person afraid of another, I think, has a lot to do with exposure. Unfortunately, people walk around and they have a limited idea of what other people are thinking. So most of what they presuppose is based on their own ideas, their own thoughts. A lot of how they react to the world is based on their vanity and optics and what they see in the mirror. So straight up, people are getting confused by wanting to see themselves in others, and they do so superficially as opposed to deeply. And I think that that's about the first instant, and we got to get past that. So as much as your question is very difficult and my answer is circuitous, you seem like you've been nodding a lot, so I'll say, all right, leave it there.
I get it. It makes sense. Thank you very much.
We were actually going to mention the clip.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think
Monroe's
it's really
film.
important to also say that, like that wonderful scene with Frances McDormand, that this very complicated thing also has to be taught. You know?
Sure.
You're not born hating other people. So if we have time, hopefully we'll get to that clip and have a chance to unpack that a little bit.
Like the famous, you have to be carefully taught.
Yes.
My name is Enzo Maldonado. I'm in 8th grade, and this is more of a question about how the film was made and directed. So when you have these events like the house is burning down, you have this theme played in the background to add more of an eeriness instead of a very dramatic event. It's more dramatic with halved with eeriness, right? So it creates this sort of tension throughout the whole film. My question is, why does this theme play like 5 times in the movie or more? And why is it so important? What was your image, and what way did you want the people to perceive this theme playing in the background as an event was happening?
I think
Are you talking about the musical theme?
right?
Musical theme?
Yeah, like why was it playing? Like what type of
The burning of
interpretation?
the churches?
No, you're
The
talking
Trevor
about
Jones' score. There's
Yeah.
a
Trevor Jones' score. Well, Trevor Jones' score is, believe it or not, you hear it in every movie and every television show now. At the time, it was quite, I won't call it revolutionary, but it was revolutionary. It was something different from you'd ever heard. It bears a resemblance to a great film called Z. Kostagawas' film. If you've never seen it, you should see it. There's a Greek composer named Mikis Theodorakis who wrote that, and that had that driving dun, 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 part of it. But it had really not found its way into American films. Now it's in every television show. 24, if you've ever watched it, is just an imitation of the score. So it was an attempt by Alan, and I think successfully, to rev it up. And he didn't. But Alan's idea of the film, and I look back and he just, I think, did a brilliant job. He just didn't want anyone to miss it. People had tried to make movies about this sort of stuff, and they did what these guys ever want me to be, is too polite. Well, they're human beings too, those guys in the hoods, you know what I mean? By the way, when you do your yearbooks out here, I assume you guys aren't going to be posing in hoods. Okay.
What's interesting.
Someday someone will explain to me how that guy, put a picture in his yearbook with.
Yes.
But it's not him. He knows it's not him.
What's interesting about Alan Parker directing this is you take a very quintessential American story. He's actually a British director, so he had a very unique objectivity, perhaps, about it.
Most of the greatest American movies were made by people who aren't Americans. Like Wyler and Capra.
Yep.
And Billy Wilder, and the consummate American filmmakers. Capra is the most American of all.
Yep.
He was born in Italy.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Maya Dominguez. I'm a junior. I remember, this is geared towards the director. For the first question that was asked of today, you said you didn't use the real names because you wanted to protect the identity of the guilty. And my question is why?
No, I meant that more facetiously than anything else. All the FBI agents were changed, and I remember somebody was a little unhappy because Chris Geromo was a basketball fan, and all of the agents are named after Boston Celtics. Kevin Dunn is Agent Bird, for example.
Yes, but
so
that's for the agents. I'm talking about the guilty, the ones that you said.
The guilty guys, we felt very strongly that if we, and it's kind of interesting in light of what happened to the film in some critical communities, where they were desperate for everything to be accurate and all the real names to be used, and we went in to tell the story, and that we weren't making a documentary, and it wasn't going to be all the real guys, but in the end, and I give Alan the most credit for it, he made a film so real and so powerful that absolutely I understand where you come from. Like, why change the names? It's exactly what happened.
Yeah, exactly.
And by the way, it's pretty much exactly what happened. The guy who threatened the mayor, for example, we made him the mayor. That's the great F. Lee Ermey, who just passed away. If you've ever seen Full Metal Jacket, he's great, not an actor. He was a drill instructor who plays a drill instructor in Full Metal Jacket. Anyway, he's wonderful in this movie. He's also recently passed away. But in retrospect, the film is very, very real. The guy who threatened the mayor was a mafia hitman, actually, who was a pal of Rupert Anderson's. And they flew him in on a little plane just like that on a very rainy evening, and they kidnapped the guy and locked him up, and he threatened him. The original scene, we went through several revisions. He put a pistol in his mouth and cocked it, and he said, "I'm going to count down from 10, and I'm not very good at counting." You know what I mean? It's like the great Viggo Mortensen, who's apparently playing an Italian now in that movie. We Italians may take that. We have a little problem with people talking like this. You know what I mean? Anyway, hey, he said, "I'm going to count down from 10. I'm not very good at counting. Particularly my best subject." And so he got to about 7 when the guy said, "What do you want to know?" But I felt the scene as it worked in the movie, and that's Baja Jola, who's one of our great actors.
I think you're asking a question about the sentencing.
Exactly,
right?
yes.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so
That's all pretty accurate, actually.
So what if people were guilty of crimes? Why couldn't the film use their real names?
It's good. In fact, in retrospect, we should have done that.
Yeah, you should have.
If you talk about the sentencing.
Just because they got sentenced in public, so why hide the names to seem, it was bad, but they learned their lesson, no.
I think to answer your
It's
question.
actually a good idea. Let's do it now.
I mean, years ago, you guys was battling a lot of legal repercussions, particularly with Weimar. It was a very complicated case, and most of the case was based off of conspiracy to the murder of the 3 civil rights workers. So that was a little
Iffy.
Convoluted area to be working in to put all those names out there. I think the film probably would have been stopped.
Larry Rainey,
something like
the
that.
sheriff, Lawrence Rainey, sued us
Yeah,
He sued the studio, and for some reason, he sued me too. I don't know why. I mean, what did I do?
So if
Anyway,
you
he
remake-
sued us both. He sued us for $6 million, and I called him the $6 Million Man. He was in, you probably don't remember. There was a television show called the $6 Million Man, and he was angry at that, so he upped it to $8 million. So he sued us, and the trial, and the case took place in Jackson, Mississippi, in the federal courthouse in Jackson. He'd been there
But
before.
go for it, because
And
we
it-
have to,
Well, keep them.
this is
It's an
set up-
amazing story.
This is the setup to why the film is so powerful and what transpired as a result of that.
He said he had nothing to do with it. What civil rights workers? I had nothing to do with what my deputy was up to, and so he sued us for libel, and we promptly proved he was in the middle of the whole conspiracy. We called a member of the Klan who said he had been told by Larry Reilly that he could. Why aren't you going to come with us to shoot these civil rights workers tomorrow night? I was busy at his aunt was like having a dinner outside of Jackson, so he couldn't come and kill 3 heroic kids, we call them, but James Chaney was a kid still. They were not yet 20. So in a second, Larry Reilly lost his case. But in the testimony from the Klansman, he said something else. He said, Reilly told me that he was involved in the murders of Emmett and Cheney in the same way that Byron Diller Beckwith told me that he shot Medgar Evers. And oops, now this passes over me as stupid white kid from the most racist city in America, Boston. And so it passes right over me. But my attorney was representing me, not the studio, a guy named Jack Abels, appropriately named. He raises his hands right out of the movies, and he says, Your Honor, can I have 10 minutes? And he goes like that to me, and we go out on the corridor of the courthouse in Jackson, which you know so well. And if you see Ghost of Mississippi, that's where we shot the trial of Beckwith. And he calls up Ed Peters, the district attorney of Hinds County, and he says, I have new evidence to get Beckwith. Beckwith was tried twice for the murder of Medgar Evers, and they were both hung juries. And he says, we can get him back. He had moved to Tennessee. We can get him here and try him again for the murder of Medgar Evers, because this evidence was not presented in the original trial. And that's how they extradited Beckwith. And that's how Ed Peters and Bobby DeLauder tried him.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how Beckwith finally went to prison for the rest of his life for the murder of.
And you're being a little modest too, because of this film, it brought so much more attention to the Myburn case and the information that came out of it. The case was reopened again. It set the atmosphere up for justice.
Preacher Kelley took away too.
Preacher Kelley.
Who's one of the people who we give a name to.
Edgar Ray Kelley. Yep.
Yeah, Edgar Ray Kelley.
We want to be very sensitive because we want to make sure that we know you have to catch that bus. So, want to maybe toss one question, just for some.
Thank you.
Just for some context.
Oh.
Yeah, if you just hold on for 1 second. This film, as you've been referencing, is really the first of 3 films. There's Mississippi Burning, which was released in '89. Then there was Ghost of Mississippi, which you referenced, which dealt with the court case about the tragedy of the Medgar Evers shooting. And your third upcoming film, which will sort of complete this unofficial trilogy, deals with the case of Emmett Till, which Keith has done the definitive documentary on, and which Michael is has written the screenplay for. With Keith. So one question I just wanted to throw out to maybe all 3 of you is, you've referenced about some of the effects that these films have had. Now, as a film programmer here, I'm a little biased to the art form of film. I think film really has a power that other art forms don't necessarily have to impact culture. The great late film critic Roger Ebert said that movies are the great machines of empathy. And it reminded me of a great quote by C.S. Lewis when he said that when I read a great book, I become 1,000 men. And so what would you hope that films like this can do for an audience, particularly a young audience? What do you hope the takeaways of films like this are?
I would have to say inspiration. How many of us who just saw this film feel inspired? I can't see your hands right now. Just like when I first saw Mississippi Burning coming out of high school, it inspired me in many ways, with me not even knowing that one day I would be a filmmaker. I call myself an unintentional filmmaker by way of Emmett Till's murder. But just meeting Mr. Zollo and knowing him for so long, I kind of forgot what inspired me the most about working with him. And so seeing this film right now, I mean, it just gave me a new breath of fresh air to continue on. So I would have to say, when we produce films of this nature, inspiration is what we want to walk away with, because it was that visual of Mississippi Burning that inspired me and helped me understand the power of filmmaking. To me, filmmaking is a new way of activism. No more should we rely on our leadership in our communities to speak about atrocities. Nothing hits you more than a visual. We're a see and touch generation. In order for us to believe it, we have to see it to believe it. And so that's what this film does to me and many others. I mean, there's been so many people in the industry right now who's been inspired by the Mississippi Burning film. I know some of us may be familiar with Jerry Mitchell, Clarion Ledger, one of the most profound civil rights writers, I have to say, in the country in terms of dealing with these unsolved civil rights murder cases. He was inspired by Mississippi Burning. And so there's many more journalists and filmmakers out there who bear witness to this film and were inspired to use this powerful medium of filmmaking to cause change.
Keith went on to make this amazing film that inspired me, and whenever I've been with Keith and really fortunate to be with him, and Michael has, and they showed the film, and my usual thing is, well, let's go to the bar while they watch the film. Obviously we've seen the film, and then we said, well, let's watch the film with them, and every time I see Untold Story of Emmett Till, for example, it does exactly that. It says everything why we want to do this. To comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable, Mencken once wrote, and that's what the job is. To watch this film right now and think of, for instance, the murder of the 9 people of color who are in their church praying, and the idea of terrorizing people while they are praying. Seeing that scene again tonight, where a person of color is not allowed to even have their moment with God, that we go and terrorize them then. I mean, the level of the horror of such a thought, that even in that personal moment, you're not allowed to freedom to worship the way you choose to worship, and the horror of that sequence. And when does Michael come out and attack the little boy while he's praying? He's not even just like that case where it was in Charleston, South Carolina, when he comes in and kills people who are praying. It's this level of, and that's what happened 2 years ago. That's
so far along,
right? And it's not 1964.
I'd like to add to what you were both saying, especially what Keith said about inspiration, and bring it even a step further, because inspiration is inside us. But a lot of what we saw on screen today is, it's not just inspiration, it's courage. And that is a learned state of mind, because the first thing that we know, being human beings, is fear. We don't like sticking our hand in the fire. We don't like being yelled at. And these are all the methods that are used to oppress. So if you clock hate or you clock oppression, you're usually thinking, oh, I don't want anything to do with this. but sometimes you just get to the point where you've seen too much, or you've turned the cheek too many times, and there's some anger inside you that's brewing up, and that appropriate anger is going to beget one or the other, right? It's either going to get more fear or courage. So I'm interested in telling the story of Emmett and stories about civil rights and stories about people being courageous, so that's a lesson that's learned by the observer or the audience, like you guys, in the same way that people are taught hate in a classroom. I think that just as many stories of courage have to be there to combat with lessons about insecurity and us versus them and better than myths.
The consistent heroism of the people of color in this movie, there were some people who said, oh wait, you're making the FBI the heroes, and they don't do anything heroic. They arrest a few people. That's sort of their job. And then they leave. All of the heroism amongst, and many children, it's true stories here, but these are people of color who are risking their lives to do this over and over again in this film. There's no cowing black folk in this film. Where does he go? He goes where Mose Wright doesn't go in the Emmett Till story, the uncle of Emmett, when Emmett is brutally kidnapped. In the corner is a shotgun. It's that close, but Mose doesn't go for the shotgun. He could have gone to the shotgun and says, get the fuck out of my house, but he doesn't. He says, they'll just beat him up and they'll bring him back to me, which, as we know, that didn't happen. But in this film, he goes for his gun. And he goes out there alone and says, I ain't taking this shit no more. And that level of heroism that you see over and over in this game is people of color who are in that place. James Chaney is such a hero. This level of heroism of this kid to do what he did against all odds. The mistake the Klan made here is they shot a couple of white boys. Anyway, I'm sorry.
Hi, I'd like to expand on what you're saying. I'm not asking a question. I am a Thornton Donovan parent, and I think we need to give really Thornton Donovan School a hand for even having I must admit, I'm not a student, as I told you. I've been at school a very long time, but I've seen many, many movies, read many, many books, studied civil rights law in law school, but I never saw Mississippi Burning. And one of the reasons why I did not see it was because I remember reading somewhere that it was fictional. But what I got from this movie was the inspiration you spoke about, right? And I think that when you talk about a story like this, which may be fictionalized in some respects, we all know, those of us who've lived a little, and some can talk to your parents, your teachers, what have you, all of us know that many of those events were real. Mm-hmm. Now, what the movie does for me is it really highlights a renewal in wanting to see Black history taught in the curriculum. The reason being because you saw our youngsters come to the microphone and ask very sincere questions. Did things like this really happen? Were people that brutal? Did hate exist to that level? They're seeing it played out right now amongst us in the media, all over the nation, and that's why Black Lives Matter has surfaced. However, I do believe that if we had Black history taught in the schools, some of our students would have to ask those questions, and it's to be taught because it's not Black history, it's American history.
Thank you.
How are we doing on time? Are we?
We regretfully have to depart, but very sincerely thank you for amending the program to accommodate us. We're delighted to be here, especially beginning Black History Month. So
Thank you.